Good morning, everyone. My name is Sambriti Nepal. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the BCCLA and I'll be moderating today's press conference. We have a number of speakers lined up today to speak about ending immigration detention in BC jails and to kick off 14 days of action. I'll start by acknowledging that at the BCCLA, we do all of our work on Indigenous lands. Moderating today's press conference. We have a number of speakers lined up today. Sorry, if somebody has the YouTube open, may I ask you to just close that window? 14 days of action. I'll start by acknowledging that at the BCCLA, we do all of our work on Indigenous lands. We have a number of speakers lined up. Sorry, if somebody has the Thank you. I'll start over. I'll start by acknowledging we do all of our work on Indigenous lands. At the BCCLA in particular, we're on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We thank the stewards of these lands. To make sure everyone can participate in today's conference, I'd like to go over some housekeeping before we begin. This event will be recorded and streamed on the BCCLA YouTube page. If you're joining us independently of media, please follow the YouTube streaming link provided in the chat. Please feel free to turn on your webcams if you're comfortable doing so. We just ask you not to make any inappropriate or distracting gestures while on camera. You can start and stop your video by clicking on the video camera icon in the taskbar below. You will also be muted for the duration of the speaker portion, but you should be able to chat with everyone in the chat box. You can see the chat box by clicking on the icon that looks like a little speech bubble on the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat to ask questions throughout the press conference or during the Q&A if you are having any tech issues. For further tech support, or if you are joining by phone, you can email owen@bccla.org. During the question and answer portion of the conference, we ask that you raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to be unmuted. You can do so by selecting the reactions button and then the raise hand button. For people on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. If you're on the computer and having audio issues, you can switch to phone audio by clicking on the arrow next to the microphone icon and selecting Leave Computer Audio. Then click Phone Call for dial-in info and select the flag for your country's dial-in information. We also have captioning and ASL provided for this press conference. Our ASL interpreter, Donna, has been spotlighted along with our speakers. If you're having trouble seeing the ASL interpreter, please get in touch either through the chat or by emailing owen@bccla.org. If you would like to turn on the captioning, you can select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and enable captioning by selecting Show Subtitle. Speaking today will be Megan McDermott, Policy Director at BC Civil Liberties Association, Wamaitha Kinuthia, Urban Advocacy and Research Lead at Justice for Girls, Julia Sand, Human Rights Law and Policy Campaigner at Amnesty International, Hannah Gross, Researcher, Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and Abdulrahman El-Mahdi, a person with lived experience in immigration detention. Megan will provide an overview of the immigration detention system and ongoing efforts to put an end to human rights violations. Wamaitha will discuss the impact of immigration detention on children and families. Julia will speak to the details of BC's complicity in human rights violations that people in immigration detention endure in BC. Hannah will describe the research findings regarding lived experience of people in immigration detention, and Abdulrahman will describe his own experience in immigration detention. Each of our speakers will speak for about 5 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for journalists. If you are a journalist and you haven't already, please change your name in Zoom to your first and last name and the outlet that you're with. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Megan to get us started. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Sambriti, and good morning. I will take another moment to recognize that myself and many others here today are living and working on unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I want to note how paradoxical it is to call for law reform from these lands, especially with respect to how colonial governments treat people coming from lands foreign to Canada. I am a lawyer with the BC Civil Liberties Association. This organization has a very broad mandate to preserve, defend, maintain, and extend civil liberties and human rights in Canada. We have a long history of work in areas around Canadian Border Services Agencies, accountability and oversight, otherwise known as the CBSA, prisoners' rights, mental health, among other issues, including the rights of migrants and refugees. Given our longstanding work in these areas, we are so very excited to be here today to tell you about the current review process that's underway in British Columbia and its significance, and to launch a 14-day campaign alongside a broad group of advocates and people with lived experience. First, I'll talk about why we're so troubled by how the CBSA uses its discretion to detain people, and how the current review in BC can positively transform standards and systems across the nation. So while the federal government has jurisdiction over immigration, hundreds of immigration detainees are incarcerated in provincial jails across the country every year, including maximum security facilities. The CBSA has full discretion over whether to detain people for immigration purposes. The most common reason for detention is that a CBSA officer claims that an individual in question may not appear for a legal proceeding. CBSA can also detain people if they're not satisfied with their identity documents and for purposes of an exam. Between April 2016 and March 2020, these grounds of detention actually represented 94% of all the cases. In a minority of cases, officers also detain individuals who are suspected of being inadmissible to Canada, or if officers believe that they pose a danger to the public. The CBSA also has full discretion as to where immigration detainees are held, and there's no legal standard guiding their decision to hold a detainee in a provincial jail rather than an immigration holding center. Immigration detainees have no means to challenge these placement decisions. So to bring this home, can you imagine being locked up in a maximum security jail with no end in sight and no option to question the decision because a government official thinks that you might not appear for a hearing that isn't even criminal in nature? As my friends here today will expand upon, these arrangements result in very traumatizing experiences for immigration detainees. And yet British Columbia and other provinces voluntarily opt into such a deplorable and unjust system. This system is propped up by long-standing agreements between the provinces and Canada. In January of this year, our government in British Columbia confirmed that it will review its immigration contract. This is the first time any province has publicly agreed to review and reconsider the agreement. Should BC do the right thing and cancel it, the impact could potentially reverberate across Canada. We're very enthusiastic then about a pending opportunity for the City of Vancouver to send a clear message to the province to end this agreement. A motion calling for such measures will be introduced on May 17th. A vote will occur on May 18th, which is 2 weeks before the BC review ends. No other city in Canada has taken this step. We are privileged and proud to be part of a coalition of organizations, groups, and concerned citizens that are launching a campaign today to educate and inspire public decision makers and the public alike. In addition to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Justice for Girls, who join me today, we have joined forces with other social justice, academic, and grassroots organizations for the campaign, as well as individuals with lived experience in immigration detention and hundreds of lawyers, academic scholars, healthcare providers, and religious leaders across Canada. Our campaign will include the public release of submissions made to the province's review process And it will feature a teach-in that will focus on the lived experiences of people in immigration detention. The 14 days of action will culminate on May 18th, when the City Council vote occurs in Vancouver. And 2 weeks later, on June 2nd, the province will conclude its review. Join us in our actions as we call on the City of Vancouver and the province of BC to seize this historic opportunity and demonstrate that this is a place where newcomers are welcomed and encouraged to thrive, and where human rights are foundational.
Thanks so much, Megan. Speaking next, we have Wenlaitha Kanutia from Justice for Girls.
Thank you. Justice for Girls is very grateful for the opportunity to join this coalition of organizations and individuals to call for an end to the unjust and inhumane practice of detaining immigrants and separating families, and to highlight the harmful impact it has on teenage girls and children in BC and Canada. Justice for Girls promotes equality, human rights, and freedom from violence for teenage girls in BC and across Canada. We are deeply concerned about the equality, human rights, and safety of teenage girls and other children who are impacted by immigration detention across the country. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child recognizes that family is a fundamental pillar of a child support system and should be protected by all countries under the international human rights framework. Article 9 of the Convention states that signatories shall ensure that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will, except when competent authorities determine that such separation is necessary for the best interest of the child. However, we know that in an overwhelming majority of cases, the best interests of the child are not being protected when families are separated due to immigration detention. Article 12 of the same convention also states that children have the right to say what they think should happen when adults are making decisions that affect them and to have their opinions taken into account. This is essential to give effect to the best interest of the child principle. Yet decisions to detain people in immigration detention routinely fail to consider their voices or their best interests. In addition to family separation causing psychological distress for both children and their parents, it leaves a girl child at a disproportionately higher risk of experiencing gender-based violence. Without the protection and support of their families, girls are left exposed to threats on both their physical and psychological safety. Where families are separated, children are at the risk of apprehension by child welfare authorities. Yet we know that children placed in child protective services in BC and across Canada are more likely to experience violence, with young girls being extraordinarily more vulnerable to threats to their safety. Without their parents, they could be placed in the care of distant relations who may not be able to appropriately safeguard their development and keep them free from experiencing more distress. Girls seeking refuge or asylum who are sent back to their home countries are forced to relive the trauma they were trying to escape without the support of the families they are separated from. Immigrants coming to Canada in search of safety and opportunity should never be subjected to this blatant abuse of their human rights. In drafting a general comment to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations clarified that countries must ensure in legislation and in practice that children can remain with family members and or guardians in non-custodial, community-based context while their immigration status is being resolved, and that this must accord with their best interests and with their rights to liberty and family life. Canada is nowhere near meeting this standard, and we have absolutely no way to assess how far we are from meeting the standard because the CBSA does not keep any consistent or reliable data on the numbers of children separated from their parents. It is impossible to fully understand the scale at which families are being affected. Canada's review under the Convention of the Rights of the Child is coming up in 2 weeks on May 17th of this year. In advance of the review, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has specifically requested that Canada provide accurate data on the situations of children who are deprived of a family environment, as well as the numbers of children impacted by immigration detention. Yet Canada has failed to provide this information in advance of their review. We hope the committee will hold Canada accountable for their failures to ratify the convention and to be transparent with the committee. The health, safety, and development of children must be prioritized in Canadian immigration policy. And we believe that British Columbia should take a stand against supporting immigration detention and instead prioritize and support the best interests of the child and fight for the preservation of their families. In signing and ratifying the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Canada agreed that a child should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding for the full and harmonious development of their personality. We therefore call on the City of Vancouver to stand up for children and families and to implore Canada to uphold their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of every child who crosses into their borders and put an end to family separation due to immigration detention. Thank you.
Thanks, Lamaitha. Next, we have Julia Sand from Amnesty International.
Good morning, everyone. It is a privilege to join so many incredible advocates, including those with lived experience, in the fight to end immigration detention in British Columbia. Although the federal government is responsible for Canada's immigration detention system, the province of British Columbia is currently complicit in the rights abuses that take place within it. Through an agreement with CBSA, BC allows immigration detainees to be held in its provincial jails. Because Canada does not limit the length of detention, people can be held in provincial jails for years with no end in sight. The longest period of detention lasted over 11 years and involved a man with an apparent mental health condition who was subjected to solitary confinement. Regardless of the length of detention, the very practice of incarcerating people in jails for immigration purposes is inconsistent with international human rights standards. By allowing its provincial jails to be used for immigration detention, BC also participates in a discriminatory system. Our research found that racialized people, and Black people in particular, appear to be incarcerated for longer periods of time and are often detained in provincial jails rather than in immigration holding centers. People with mental health conditions are also subjected to disproportionately coercive treatment, including being incarcerated in provincial jails and placed in solitary confinement. This discrimination is a clear violation of both international and domestic human rights law. We are calling on the government of British Columbia to end the use of its provincial jails for immigration detention. This will help to end the worst conditions of detention in the province. In the course of our advocacy, many have asked where people would go if immigration detention were abolished. I want to stress that immigration detention is not a form of housing. On the contrary, immigration detention removes people from their homes, their families, communities, and employments. Even for people who have just arrived in Canada, detention interferes with their ability to access effective legal advice and representation, to secure housing and employment, to connect with family members and loved ones, and to become settled in the community. There are viable alternatives to the system. This was demonstrated shortly after the pandemic began, when authorities released significant numbers of people. Unfortunately, this trend has not lasted, and CBSA has once again started to detain increased numbers of people. In addition to being a practice that causes long-lasting and devastating harms, immigration detention is incredibly costly. In 2016, the federal government committed to spending $138 million to make the immigration detention system, quote, better and fairer. The vast majority of these funds were used to build and expand immigration holding centers, which represent or resemble medium security prisons. Despite this investment, the proportion of people CBSA incarcerated in provincial jails more than doubled in the year the pandemic began. The federal government pays the province a daily amount for each person incarcerated in a provincial jail. In British Columbia, this amount is $235 per person per day. These funds could instead be used to invest in community-based organizations who provide humane, tailored, and compassionate support instead of punitive confinement and surveillance. Canada's immigration detention system is rights abusing and harmful. We call on British Columbia to end the use of its provincial prisons for immigration detention by canceling its contract with CBSA. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Speaking next, we have Hannah Gross from Human Rights Watch.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I would like to focus my remarks today on the lived experiences of people who were locked up in immigration detention and have generously shared their stories with us. Some of the most serious human rights violations happen to people who are out of sight and out of mind. Over the past decade, Canada has incarcerated tens of thousands of people in immigration detention, including children and people who are seeking safety. People for whom Canada represents a hope and a home. Many are forced to endure some of the most restrictive conditions of confinement, including maximum security provincial jails, and to do so without a countdown to a date of release. Not only are these violations of international human rights law, but they also have devastating effects on people's mental health. One of the most damaging aspects about the immigration detention system is that there is no limit to how long people can be deprived of their liberty. Many of the people I interviewed who experienced immigration detention firsthand told me that the uncertainty about how long detention would last was a defining feature of their experience. The notion that they just couldn't know when life would get back to normal, that uncertainty can shred every last bit of hope that people hold on to in immigration detention. This can create such an intense sense of powerlessness that many people in immigration detention contemplate taking their own lives. Another common theme from our conversations was the shock that people felt at being detained, particularly in provincial jails. As my friends here today mentioned, CBSA remains the only major law enforcement agency in the country without independent civilian oversight. And one of CBSA's most consequential powers within the immigration detention system is that the agency has full authority over where people are detained. Our research found that according to CBSA policy, the agency may incarcerate people with mental health conditions in provincial jails specifically because of their health condition. This is clearly discriminatory. CBSA representatives justified this practice by claiming that people have access to, quote, specialized care in provincial jails, and that their behavior can be, quote, better managed in those facilities. Instead of receiving vital support, people with psychosocial disabilities are subjected to disproportionately coercive treatment in immigration detention. I've also spoken to people who express suicidal ideation while in immigration detention. And in response, authorities put them in solitary confinement. One man told me, quote, after I was on suicide watch, I didn't want to tell anyone that I was struggling. I remember that steel bed. You put cadavers there after you're dead, end quote. The devastating impact of immigration detention can last for months and years, and the consequences can ripple to people's loved ones as well. The immigration detention system stands in stark contradiction to the image many Canadians and people around the world have of this country and this province as a welcoming, multicultural safe haven. There is a rich fabric of community-based organizations that provide tailored and compassionate support services to newcomers. But migrants and refugee claimants cannot access these services while they're in jail. Instead, many people are re-traumatized before they could even begin their lives in Canada. BC has an opportunity to stop the human rights violations that immigration detainees endure in the province's jails, and instead to ensure that people seeking safety and a better life are treated with humanity and dignity. Our next speaker has kindly agreed to share with us his own experiences in immigration detention. Abdulrahman El-Mahdi is a man with hearing disability, and he arrived in Canada to claim refugee protection from Egypt in 2017. He spent approximately 2 months in immigration detention, where he was deprived of his hearing aid batteries. Abdulrahman, thank you for your courage and your determination. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Abdurrahman Al-Madi. I arrived in Canada in 2017 to seek refugee protection. My life changed on that day. The months that followed were some of the darkest time in my life. I fled from Egypt because my life was in danger. I'm a human rights activist. I love my country, but I know I could not survive with the Egyptian military regime in power. I left behind my beloved wife and 2 young boys. I miss my family desperately, and it breaks my heart to be apart from them. When I landed at Vancouver International Airport, I was filled with hope and anticipation. I know Canada was a country that stands for freedom and human rights. And I feel deep in my bones I would finally be at home and safe. But instead of finding freedom, I was arrested without charge. I was handcuffed and shackled. My belongings were taken away, including the rechargeable battery to my hearing aids. I have a hearing disability, and I depend on hearing aids. Without them, I'm in complete silence. I have lived that way since I was child. Within hours in arriving in Vancouver, I was in jail. I was confused and scared. I had to try navigating my way through jail with a language barrier. And I also could not hear anyone or anything. I did not know why I was arrested and detained. I did not know why I was put in handcuffs. I did not know why I was in jail. I did not know how long I would be there. I did not know who I could ask these basic questions. I did not know who I could trust. I spent my first night in Canada in Vancouver jail. My face in Canada was violently shattered, and I was alone in jail and in silence. This will always be my introduction to Canada. The next morning, I couldn't hear the guard who was trying to wake me up. I woke up to him trying to shake me awake. I looked at him and I couldn't hear him. I did not know what was happening. It was a terrifying reality check. I was imprisoned in the country where I thought I would find freedom, the country where I thought refugees find safety. Over the following 2 months, I was incarcerated in 3 different jails in BC. I was repeatedly handcuffed and shackled and strip-searched. This was absolutely humiliating, and I could not understand why any of this happening to me. I was terrified of people around me, and I had no idea why I was there. I just cried. While I was detained, I was only provided with 1 hearing aid battery at a time, and only for CBC meetings and hearings. The batteries would run out after a few hours. I would try to save the battery as much as possible and turn on my hearing aid only for very important situations. I spent most of my time in jail in silence. One of the most difficult parts of being in immigration detention was that I had no idea when I would be released. I met some people who had been in jail for immigration reasons for months. And they also did not know how much longer they would be locked up. I became convinced that I would be in jail for the rest of my life in silence without my hearing aids, and that no one would know about me. I did not know how to cope with this. What's the point of counting the days if you are not counting towards anything? I lost my faith in justice. I lost my hope. For most of my life, I could only dream of human rights. I thought that in Canada, I would feel what it's like to have human rights protected and respected. But while I was in immigration detention, moving from jail to jail, I experienced such deep injustice. I was absolutely shocked in those conditions. Depression can take over and swallow up everything. I felt like my life might as well end. Once I was released and got a work permit, I started working very hard trying to forget. There's something wrong with this system, but this is a beautiful country. Day by day, I try to move forward and heal. I feel like I belong here. I feel like my life is here. I am a human being. I have a hearing disability. I have also a family, like anyone else. When my boys ask me when they are going to see me again, I don't know what to tell them. After 5 years of being separated from them, I consider it a miracle that they still love me like a dad. Every day, I feel like I'm dying inside. I'm dying inside without my family. I just want to live in a peaceful way, like one of you. I hope that other people coming to this country can receive more humane introduction. I urge BC government to do the right thing and stop allowing CBC to incarcerate immigration detainees in provincial jails. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdulrahman, for sharing your experience, for calling for change, for speaking your truth. No one should experience the injustice you've experienced, and we're so grateful that you've taken the time to join us here today. With that, I'll open the floor up for questions. I'll note that Abdulrahman will not be taking questions at this time, but if you have questions for any of our other speakers, please raise your hand and I can unmute you so that you're able to ask a question. I'm not seeing anybody having any questions via audio, and I don't note any questions in the chat. So we can close off the press conference now. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for speaking. And thank you to the folks who've provided ASL interpretation, Donna, and to Lisa for providing captioning service.